Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of this public hearing. Mr. Alton.
Chair, the first witness this morning, already sitting in the witness box, is Howard Groves.
Please stand.
No, if you just repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
First of all, Mr. Groves, give us your full name, if you would, please.
Howard Groves.
Mr. Groves, let me ask you, first of all, something about your career in the police force. When did it begin?
1980s, the 6th of October 1980.
1980.
Yeah.
And where did you begin your police career?
Cannon Row, which at the time was A District.
And
So
what
West
did A District cover?
It would have been the West End.
The West End.
Yes.
And I'm looking at your inquiry statement, which, if you want to refresh your memory, Mr. Groves, the panel will find it in the first tab, behind the first tab in their bundle.
Yeah.
In your first paragraph, you go through your career. Tell us a little more. So, Police Constable, A District, Cannon Row.
Correct.
And where from there?
From there, I remained in A District to start with because I was in uniform for the first 2 years during my probationary period.
As a police constable?
As a police constable.
Yeah.
And then I joined what was then called the crime squad. It was the lead up to being a detective. You'd have to be on the crime squad for a few years.
Slow down. Do you see these ladies here tapping away, Mr. Groves?
My apologies.
You're not going to make friends with them if you speak as quickly as you do. So let's just slow down. So, in preparation for the crime squad, yes? Tell us
Correct.
what you were doing?
Correct.
No. My question was, you said something about being in preparation for the crime squad. You were doing something.
Yes. Before you join the CID at that time, you'd normally have to be on the crime squad.
Right. And did you eventually make the crime squad?
Yes.
And when was that?
That would have been about 1983.
And from there, where did you go from there?
I then became a detective constable, and I would have moved. My first posting was Kilburn as a detective constable.
Yeah. And from then you climbed up the ranks, eventually becoming a detective chief inspector?
Yes.
When was that?
My last posting was as a detective chief inspector on the Homicide and Serious Crime Command,
Yeah,
of which you're familiar.
I am. And when did you retire?
I retired in 2014, July.
Thank you. Now, going back to when you were a young police constable, did you work on an operation? I think initially you struggled when you made a statement in 2015 to remember the operational name. At first you thought it was Broadsword, but eventually you came to realise it was Operation Circus.
That is correct. I can explain the reasoning behind that if you so wish. I can explain the reasoning behind.
Well, yes, in a sentence or two.
Yes. I remember being part of at least 2 investigations involving indecency with young boys. And I remember one of them specifically, which was Broadswords. And for whatever reason, I had assumed at that point that Operation Circus, I was referring to Broadswords as Operation Circus.
Right. But eventually you came to realise that it was Operation Circus that you were speaking about. And in general terms, as you remember it now, what was the remit of Operation Circus, or at least the part of Operation Circus you were involved with?
My understanding is that they were dealing with allegations of indecency with boys, and that a large quantity of photographs had been recovered during a search, and I had been seconded onto that team in order to look identify venues and possibly victims based on the photographs that have been recovered. That was my sole role, along with other officers.
So let's just think about this. You were still a PC at Cannon Row at the time?
No, I was on the crime squad, yes, as a PC.
Crime squad at this time, but which station were you working out of?
Rochester Row.
Right. And so your function at the time was to presumably go through a batch of photographs which had been seized by other officers.
Well, my recollection, we didn't actually go through the batch. We were actually handed photographs and say, go and identify who these boys are or where these photographs may have been taken. We weren't privy to actually physically deciding which ones we were going to.
No. But presumably it was more than just you doing this task.
Yes, of course.
And therefore, presumably you, Mr. Groves, were handed a certain amount of photographs, and your colleagues,
Yes.
however many
Yes.
other individuals.
They were part of actions that we
That's what I meant by a batch. You were
Yes.
handed a number of photographs and asked to go through them, and you were asked to go through them with a view to identifying victims, the boys who were
venues.
involved in them, the locations in which these indecent incidents had taken place,
Correct.
as well as presumably potential offenders.
Yes.
Yeah. And without going into any graphic detail, the nature of the photographs were what?
There were photographs of boys in compromising positions.
Yeah. With adults,
Yes.
adult men.
Yes.
And when we look, and if you want to look with me, you can, at a statement you made on the 4th of August 2015, the panel will find this statement behind their third tab.
Yeah.
This is the typewritten version. The typewritten version is actually dated the 4th of April 2015. It should be August.
That is correct.
You've got the handwritten version there. We don't need to look at that,
Yes.
but it's the 4th of August.
Yes.
Of 2015, and if you look to the third paragraph, in terms of dating this tasking that you had, you estimated then in 2015 it was between 1983 and 1985,
Correct.
and you were working on that inquiry for around 6 months.
To the best of my recollection, that is correct.
And you went through in your inquiry statement, so if we go back please to the second tab, where you, the first tab, where it's in the bundle for the chair and the panel, you went through at paragraph 2 on the second page, what you did and the people you remember working with, including at the end of paragraph 2, a Detective Constable Phil Marshall.
That is correct.
And if we want to look at some other names that you remembered, if we go back please to the typewritten version of the 4th of August 2015 statement, you mention him on the first page in the fifth paragraph.
Yes.
DC Marshall, remember him as Phil.
Yeah.
You describe him. You also remembered in the next paragraph somebody called Dave Lloyd, another senior detective who you refer to as Grandad, presumably because of his seniority.
Yes.
And also a senior detective by the name of Alan Findell.
Correct.
Now, the photographs which you and your colleagues had been asked to examine, they had been seized at an address in Ealing by other officers on the Operation Circus
That is correct.
operation. Now, the reason you're here, Mr. Groves, is because you have a recollection about a briefing that was given to officers when you were a police constable about what should happen in the event that prominent members of society should be encountered during the course of your tasking, presumably. And I want to ask you, please, a little about that. If we go to your statement, if we have it still open, the 2015 statement, and we go to the second page. You can see what you said in 2015 at the top. At some point during the investigation, we were briefed by a senior officer. The salient point from the briefing was that if we identified any prominent members of society, and you say, I took this to mean MPs, royalty, or other distinguished individuals, the inquiry was to cease. I can't recall who gave the briefing, where it took place, or who else was present. At the time, I thought the decision was strange, but as a junior PC, I went with it at the time. Throughout my time on the inquiry, I wasn't aware of any prominent people being identified. Now, first of all, do you remember now where this briefing took place?
No, I couldn't be specific. I knew it would happen during the realms of being on that inquiry.
Presumably in a police station?
More than likely, but not necessarily, because sometimes if I think long and hard about it, a lot of times those investigations would have taken place somewhere away from the actual police stations.
So it was away from the police station?
More than likely, yes.
Why do you say that?
Because that is my vague recollection that it wouldn't physically have been at a police station. It would have probably been at a HQ or something like that.
All right, but a police premises?
Police premises, yes.
Is what you have in mind?
Yes.
And am I right in thinking that over all the years you've not been able to put a name to the officer who gave the briefing?
No, as you can appreciate, this happened some 30-odd years ago.
What about his seniority?
No.
I assume it was a male officer.
More than likely during that time.
What sort of seniority?
It could very well have been a sergeant or above. I genuinely can't remember. It would be wrong for me to say it was a sergeant or it was an inspector. I cannot recall.
Now, let's have a look at what you said in your, I call it the inquiry statement. It has an MPS reference, but it's your 2019 statement on pages 2 and 3, paragraph 4. Have you got that, Mr. Groves?
Yes.
I can remember being briefed by a supervisor or manager in relation to a confidential investigation dealing with allegations of indecency involving young boys. This could have been a sergeant, but I can't remember any specific briefings or how many I attended. I cannot remember whether the briefings were held daily or weekly. I can't recall how long I was on the operation for. Is this the briefing you're talking about, or is this just in general terms?
Well, in general terms, it's highly unlikely that there would have been that many briefings that I would have attended.
Yeah. The
chances are a lot of the information would have been fed back to us by whoever was supervising us. But I was certainly at a briefing at some point. Mm. And this is the bit that I shall take my time and try and explain as best I can. I have been grappling with this for many years. And I can remember, although it may not have been said explicitly, it will stop. There was certainly an inference that if we had identified anyone of prominence, that could be a possibility.
Let's just look at paragraph 5. I can, however, remember someone saying that the operation would cease if prominent people were encountered. I can't remember who said this or when exactly during the operation this was said. And then you deal with what it was that triggered your recollection.
Yes.
About it. Can I ask you this? What was it about what was said to you, or what you inferred from what was said to you, that prominent people meant MPs, royalty, or other distinguished individuals?
My recollection was there had been a discussion after that briefing, and the view from others that I'd spoken to was that they were referring to MPs or persons of note, for a better word.
Right. Did it include celebrities?
There's a possibility, but I can't say specifically.
And when you say there was a discussion after the briefing, do you mean literally after the briefing ended, or at some other point in time?
Some other point in time, yes.
Amongst what? Officers who attended the briefing or other officers?
People who were at the briefing and others who possibly were not at the briefing at the time. But sorry for interrupting you.
No,
but as I'm trying to explain, it is something that for years, at the time, I thought it would, even though it was back in the day, and some people may have said back in the 80s, things like that may have been said or done. I thought it was still very strange, even then back in the 80s, for such a comment to have been made.
And when the comment was made, Mr. Groves, did you make your views plain that you felt it was strange?
No, not at that. No, I certainly didn't. No,
Because
I was junior in service, and I don't want to add other things to it, but I didn't think it was my place. Being a black officer, I was not going to raise my head above the parapet.
So was it a question, if you don't mind me asking, of your inexperience and your lower ranking that made you not report it to
Yes.
anyone, or was there the racial...
No, it was more my rank at the time. I'm just saying, at that time, I would have been one of very few black officers in the Met at that point.
Yeah.
And if anybody can remember back to the 1980s, it was a difficult time.
Yeah.
And at that junior in service, I didn't have the confidence at that point to say something. If it was said years later, I most certainly would have.
Yeah. Do you think, in general terms, there was a culture of deference among junior police ranks towards those in seniority in the 1980s?
Very much so.
Did that culture of deference, so I'm not talking about deference to people in prominent positions, I'm
yes.
talking about deference within police ranks.
Yes,
Did that deference continue to exist over the years that you were in the force up to the time of your retirement, or did it dissipate?
No, it dissipated. But in the early days, in the early 80s, you would salute senior officers. They'd look at your shoes and they'd criticise you, and you knew exactly where they were coming from. But as the years went on, it was far less. It became less of a disciplined service, for a better word.
So you didn't question. You didn't question what you had been told in the course of this briefing?
No. But as I said before, I felt that was not right.
What about your colleagues of similar rank to you? Did you discuss with your colleagues and friends in the force and those who'd been at the briefing that you didn't think that this was right?
I most certainly did, but to be perfectly candid with you, it wasn't something that became the focus of my attention or anybody else on the team. I certainly commented on it to other officers, but it wasn't something that we kept going back to. We just got on with the job. I was a young constable who found myself on a very sensitive investigation at a very early stage of my career, and I just got on with the job that I was asked to do.
At this briefing, Mr. Groves, appreciated as I'm sure we all do now, it's a long time ago. How many officers were there?
I can't remember how many would have been there.
Give us a, for instance.
If you push me, 10, 15 officers.
And all junior ranks or some senior ranks?
The likelihood there would have been of varying ranks.
Yeah. And did anybody raise an objection or a query to the officer giving this briefing? Why on earth?
No,
why on earth should we cease this operation, which we're all working very hard on, if we come across a person of public prominence?
As I said earlier, from my recollection, It wasn't a question that the person said, if this happens, if we find anything about anybody of an MP, for instance, that this will stop. No, it wasn't as straightforward as that. It was a sort of an implied suggestion that that could be a possibility.
Well, of course, we weren't there and you were.
Yes.
But presumably, whoever was giving the briefing had to utter the words to make it plain to the rank and file who were on the operation that if they were to encounter MPs, royalty, other distinguished individuals during the course of this operation, that the operation would cease or that the investigation into those individuals would cease. What was it?
The investigation would cease.
Into that individual.
Yes.
So whichever way it was couched during the briefing, during the course of the briefing, you in particular came away from that briefing in no uncertain terms realising that if going through the photographs you were to come across somebody you recognised as an MP or a peer or a member of the royal household, for example, that no investigation would continue into that individual.
That was a likely outcome.
Well, explain this, Mr. Groves. Let's say that had exactly happened. Let's say that you were examining a particular batch of photographs and you came across a photograph of a well-known MP in the 1980s. What would you have done about it?
I'd have given it to the sergeant, and whatever inquiries were done, I'd have handed it to them, and that would have been it.
Yeah.
I was not in a position of influence or power to make any decision around what happened next. And can I also add that, with the greatest respect, in the 80s, you did what you were told to do. Yeah. As you mentioned about the nature of the culture at that point. You're not going to stand there in that meeting and argue with a senior officer what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. That just would not happen. This is not 2015, 16 or 17. This was 1983.
3 months pass, having given that photograph to your sergeant, and nothing happens, and you speak to your sergeant in the police station canteen and say, Sarge, what happened, by the way, do you remember that photograph I gave you with that well-known MP doing unspeakable things to that rent boy? And he says, well, I couldn't take it any further because I was told from up high not to investigate that individual.
I think you've got it wrong, Mr. Altman. That would not have happened because we were attached or seconded to that team. Those officers would have been from possibly some other part of the West End Central. I would have gone back to Rochester Row and I would have had no contact with that sergeant or anyone in the future. That's just the way it was. The scenario you paint would have been great, but that's not the reality.
Well, and perhaps you've taken it a bit literally. But what if let's just imagine, Mr. Groves, that looking at these photographs, you've come across a photograph of an MP, and the photograph's been passed up for investigatory purposes, and you discover that nothing's happened.
I wouldn't have known what had happened, to be perfectly honest with you.
Would you not ask?
No, because we were just there to carry on and do a particular task, and once we had completed our actions, we would have written it up. For instance, there would have been occasions where we had an action to go to Borough-in-Furness or to Loughborough University, which are two particular areas I remember us going to.
Because of what the locations in the photographs?
Yes, because of the photographs and other documentation which supported some of those photographs. So we'd have gone to Loughborough University, we went to one of the dormitories, and we identified a particular room based on the wallpaper. We would have completed our action, handed it to the desk sergeant who would have been in charge, and that would have been it. We would have no influence or decision-making about what happened next. We wouldn't ask any questions because as far as we were concerned, we've done our bit, we've handed it over, and that it is.
And as far as you're concerned, certainly from what you viewed among the photographs, no people of public prominence were identified.
No.
What about by your colleagues?
I have no information or recollection of anything like that happening. No. If it did, and I was aware of it, I would have remembered it, and you would have been hearing about it now.
Tell us about this. The photographs that you did see, which must have involved rent boys, or at least a term that's being used, boys who prostituted themselves.
Yes.
What sort of ages were the boys that you saw in these photographs?
They would have been as young as 11, 12, a bit older, some of them.
And help us with this, certainly as far as you're concerned, or whether there was any policy on the Operation Circus team that if you had been able to identify any of those boys, what would have happened? What would you have done?
We would have written that up on the action sheet, what we identified, and as I said, that would have gone straight in to the sergeant in charge of the what we would call the major incident room.
Yeah.
And then they would take that information and they would decide what happened. We wouldn't be able to decide to do our own work as you see on television. Or so we'll go off now and we'll do an investigation to try and find this victim. We'd write it up, we'd provide supporting information to say why we've identified, how we identified this person. We'd hand it back into the inquiry team and then they would then decide on action in it to somebody else. We were just solely there looking at those photographs and trying to progress that line of inquiry. Nothing more.
Do you know from anything you were told at the time or understood whether if a boy or boys were identified, particularly ones who were children, whether other agencies would become involved, such as social services, or whether they'd be taken off the street or helped or any other welfare?
No, I had no clue what happened next.
You've no clue?
No. In a lot of investigations back in the 80s, they are completely different from my experience as an SIO. When you have investigations now, for instance, a murder, you would sit down with your team at an office meeting and you would go through all the actions that people have done and what information has been gathered. So everybody on the team has a better understanding of what's happening with that investigation. Back in the 80s, they were like you were working in silos. You would do your bit, but you had no clue what sometimes other people were doing because you were never part of that structure which allowed you to have a better understanding of the case. And that was the failings, I would suggest, back in the 80s as compared to now. We had many officers, most of my colleagues who were constables, did not really have a good understanding of what was actually happening under that investigation. That was just the way business was done back in the 80s.
Well, let's fast forward to the time at which you retired from the force. Looking back at the tasking you had at the time, do you think that would look very different today?
Very much different.
In what sense? Would you know much more about the policy of the operation that you were just a part of, and would you understand what was happening in the investigation generally, even those parts which you weren't directly involved in?
Well, I was a senior investigating officer. I was the person in charge, so I led from the front. But I made sure that we had regular briefings, and I would ask people questions on the state of certain actions that had been done, and everybody in that room would have an understanding of where the investigation was and where we were heading, what lines of inquiries we were going to progress, and which ones we weren't for a particular reason. And I would have a decision log, and everything would have been recorded in a decision log. So everybody was familiar with the investigation, which is completely different in the 80s.
Yeah, but is this your personal style of case management, or is this something that was common currency in the Met amongst all SIOs dealing with cases right across the whole?
Common policies throughout the Met, the murder teams. That's how business was done. And I joined the murder team in 2007, having only done secondments 2 or 3 times prior to that. And that was a system that I inherited, and that's a system that I made sure continued.
Yeah. But we're not talking about murder here.
I know, but it's still an investigation.
Yeah, but my question is to grow so that we don't, so that there's no possibility of confusion. My real question is, if you were the SIO of an operation like Circus,
yes,
taking place at the time of your retirement, would the PC doing the job that you did back in the 80s on Circus look very different to the job that was done then?
That is correct. based on what I've just said, how I do business. But I appreciate that it's still a major inquiry based on Operation Circus. But yes, it would look completely different.
Now, what triggered, as I understand it, and you said this in your, as I call it, the inquiry statements of paragraph 5, what triggered your memory about this briefing was the fact that in 2012, and I'm looking at paragraph 5, you were watching television, you thought, or you read about Dolphin Square, and that triggered your memory about all those years ago on Circus.
That is correct.
And as a result, you spoke to, amongst others, a Detective Superintendent John Sweeney, Detective Inspector Smith, and others about your concerns.
Yes. I remember the chances are there was something on the television about Dolphin Square. And I remember ringing another colleague of mine who had retired. But when, back in 1983, he was also based at Cannon Row. And I remember him saying something to me which I think is slightly relevant, and I know you're likely to come to this. There was a senior officer called Trevor Lloyd Hughes, and the comment made by
This is Mike Ward. Are you talking about Mike Ward?
No.
Who are you talking about?
The colleague is somebody who used to be a sergeant at that time at Cannon Row, years ago, when I joined.
Give us his name?
His name was Gordon Canham.
Right.
And I remember him saying to me, we were talking about, I said to him about Dolphin Square, and I mentioned my experience, which we were talking about. And he said something which I thought was quite stark. He said, I thought it was strange that Trevor Lloyd Hughes was, and he used the expression, the fox with the keys for the chicken coop. And I thought, and I said to him, and he said, well, don't you know what he was like? And I said, yeah, I heard the rumours. And I thought there was a stark thing to have said at that point.
No.
But he was a senior officer who's been given the keys as a fox with all the chickens in the coop. And I thought that was quite stark for him to say that.
Well, did you know what he was actually saying by that?
Yes, because,
what was he saying?
Because at that point, with the greatest respect, and I know Mr. Lloyd Hughes has passed away, but the view at that point was that he was, not that it's wrong, but he was homosexual and had relationships, possibly even officers.
All right. And so during that conversation, this brother officer back from the 1980s put into your head, what, that Trevor Lloyd Hughes...
No, he didn't put it in my head. I was aware of that, but
right.
It was a Dolphin Square issue that I saw on the television, and I thought, Rent Boys, this whole thing is coming up again, and that triggered me. And I remember discussing it with my wife and saying, this has been something I've been, mulling over for years and years and years and years. And she said to me, well, if it's bothering you so much, then you need to do something about it. Hence the reason, when I went into work, I remember walking straight into the inspector's office, my DI's office, and I closed the door and I said, look, boys, I need to explain something to you because this has been nagging me for years. And I relayed to them that discussion, and they then said to me, well, you need to speak to someone. Hence the reason why I then spoke to John Sweeney and relayed my account of events to him.
Right. And so you were still a serving officer. You had 2 years left at that point.
Correct.
But it was something that, as you just told us, you'd been mulling over for years and years, and it was clearly something that had bothered you by the sound of it.
Yes. Without putting a finer point on it, the three things in my service that have kind of stuck: that incident, and years later, when an officer challenged my position as an inspector. I was at Hillingdon Borough, and it was a murder investigation, and I was the first senior officer at the scene. And when an officer from the murder team arrived, he asked, who's in charge? And my colleagues, my junior officers, pointed to me and said, he is. And he said, who? He? With reference to my colour. So those are the two things that have stuck with me for years. So for those who may think that I'm making this up, those two things have stuck with me for all of my service.
Well, I do have to ask you this, Mr. Groves, not about the second.
No, I appreciate that, but what I'm trying to say to you is those two incidents have left an indelible mark on me as a police officer.
But the first of them begs this question, Mr. Groves, which I ask for an answer. If that first incident had stuck with you for all of those years from the 1980s, why was it 2012 was the first time you mentioned it to anyone? You could, you'll accept, have gone to the Police Complaints Board or the Police Complaints Authority, which it became, or the IPCC, which it still was in 2014. Why didn't you do any of those things?
Because throughout the early years of my service, I was not going to bring something like that to the attention of anybody. I just wanted to get on with the job. I just wanted to do what I wanted to do, was be a police officer. In 2012, I was a lot older, I was a lot wiser, probably a lot more uglier, but I felt confident at that point that I had to get that off my chest. That's the sole reason. When you're a young PC, there's a lot of things. If you put 4 or 5 officers in here, I'm sure they can recount things that they look back over a period of years and think, maybe I could have dealt with something slightly different, maybe I could have challenged somebody about something. But like most people, you just want to get on and do your job. And that's what I felt I did. But at some point, partly because of this Dolphin Square thing, it kind of triggered me, and I thought, you know what, I'm confident enough now to say to my colleagues, this is something that I don't want to leave the service and not mention it and then regret it when I've left the service and then say, well, I want to tell somebody about it afterwards. I felt at that point a need and a desire to get it off my chest, for a better word, and hence the reason why 2012. If I had my chance to do it all over again, maybe I would have probably done it slightly sooner, but not in the early years, certainly not in the first 5, 10 years of my service, because I would have been concerned about how that may have impacted on me. Now, I'm not really bothered about what people may think as to why I did or didn't, because I know I've done the right thing by mentioning it.
But you accept, Mr. Groves, and I'm not criticising you, but you accept it is something that you could have done.
Yes.
As you climbed up the ranks, you were no longer a junior, inexperienced officer, and it is something, if it did bother you for all of those years, as you tell us it did, then it is something that you could have done in the intervening years.
I could have done.
Now, can we look, please, and I'm sure you have yourself had made available to you, 2 closing reports by the IOPC. The first one I'd like you to look at is Operation Osier, which is behind tab 4 in the Chair and Panel's bundle.
Yes.
And can I ask you, please, to go to paragraph 20, which is on page 4 of 7.
Yeah.
Now, here, in this part of the report, Mr. Groves, the IOPC were summarising the account that you had given, which is the account that we see in your statements of August 2015. And at paragraph 20 it says, Groves said he was unable to recall the identity of the senior officer who gave the briefing. He was questioned about his knowledge of Trevor Lloyd Hughes and asked if Lloyd Hughes could have been the officer that gave the briefing. Groves recalled Lloyd Hughes and believed that he may have had overall responsibility for the investigation. He didn't recall any specific actions or decisions taken by Lloyd Hughes, or if he was the senior officer that gave the briefing, he was unable to recall where the briefing took place or the identity of other persons that were present. Now, that was your state of mind, at least according to the Osier report. And that appeared to be your state of mind certainly in 2015 when you made a statement.
That is correct. I couldn't say that he gave the briefings. His name was mentioned to me when I was doing my statement, and I then said that it was likely that he would have been in charge of the investigation, but I have no recollection of any contact with him or him delivering that particular briefing with the comments made, which I had suggested.
And if we look, while we have it open, please, to the final page of the OSIA report, without going through all of the detail, this report has been adduced in evidence and therefore it's available to be looked at. But under the heading analysis on the final page, it has been established that Howard Groves was seconded to Operation Circus, which commenced in 1984 under the direct supervision of Detective Superintendent Colin Reeve. I'll come back to him in a moment. But is that a name that meant anything to you, Reeve?
No.
Is that a failure of memory that you're saying he wasn't the officer in overall charge, or you just don't recognise the name?
Just don't recognise the name. And to be honest with you, at that point in my junior in service, the names wouldn't have meant an awful lot to me.
No. Groves initially thought that his inquiry was named Operation Broadsword, but recanted when he was reminded of Operation Circus. An examination of the Operation Circus files confirmed this, and Groves agreed that this was the investigation to which he was referring. Next paragraph, Operation Circus has been investigated under a separate IOPC-managed inquiry named Operation Jordana. Howard Groves was visited on completion of this investigation, and despite his recollection of events at a briefing, he understands that this is not supported by the testimony of other police witnesses. Howard Groves was satisfied that a proportionate investigation had been undertaken in this matter, and he accepts the outcome. Pausing there, is that a fair reflection of your attitude towards the investigation?
Yes.
Paragraph 36, none of the witnesses interviewed as part of this investigation and Operation Jordana have any recollection of the events as described by Groves. And I'd like to turn, if I may, please, to Jordana, which is, for the panel and for you, Mr. Groves, behind tab 5. Now, if we focus on the first paragraph, Operation Jordana was set up in 2014 to investigate allegations that a confidential police operation in 1984 targeting rent boys in and around Piccadilly Circus had been closed down early, and evidence was suppressed to protect persons of prominence. The confidential operation, which had become known as Operation Circus, commenced in the spring of 1984, and therefore that gives us, as it were, a touch point of when Operation Circus began, the spring of 1984, and was initially conducted by a small group of local police officers based in the West End of London. The actions of those officers led to a large number of arrests, charges, and subsequent convictions of offenders involved in child sexual abuse. And we can go perhaps to page 39 without going through all of the nitty-gritty, but I will come back to a couple of paragraphs. If we go to paragraph 39,
Yes.
Paragraph 212 deals with you, because there were a number of other officers former officers who gave evidence to Jordana. But as far as you were concerned, the concerns put forward by you, Mr. Groves, regarding a briefing given by a senior officer can't be given any provenance, is the way the report reads. No other officers interviewed support this statement, leaving the matter beyond further proportionate investigation, fully dealt with in Operation Osier. And in fact, I think if I've got my statistics right, have you got the right page, Mr. Groves? I'm looking at page 39 of Jordana.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, so have a look at 212.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
No other officers interviewed support this statement, leaving the matter beyond further proportionate investigation, fully dealt with in Operation Osier, which is what we just looked at. And if I have it right, I think 17 other officers were interviewed, and none of them recalled any such briefing. You accept that, presumably?
If that's what they say, but that doesn't detract from my recollection of what happened.
Yeah. And you maintain the position
yes,
that this is what happened?
100%. 100%.
Can I go within the report, please, to paragraph 91, just to look at what the command hierarchy was in Operation Circus. Page 18, paragraph 91.
Yep.
And this was in the interview by Jordana of a man called Stephen Kershaw. Mean anything to you? A Vine Street probationer in 1982?
Yeah, the name Steve Kershaw, I vaguely recall it.
Did you work with him?
I don't remember working with him on that particular investigation,
But
I believe at some point in my service I may have worked with him, yes.
Yeah. Paragraph 91, he identified the command structure of Operation Circus as Inspector John Hoodless being in operational command, Mike Platt as hands-on supervisor. He also recalled Laurie Young, Terry Lawlaw, Alan Smith and DC Vince Payne. He identified Detective Superintendent Colin Reeve as being in overall charge and the senior management team link into Vine Street. Now, do any of those names mean anything to you?
No. As I said, even over the years, those names don't mean anything. But certainly at the time of that inquiry, as I said, I was junior in service. A lot of those people, I would not have any clue who they were.
Thank you. Can we go back then, please, to page 14 and 15 of the Jordana report? Page 14 is the beginning of the interview Jordana had with John Hoodless, the erstwhile inspector. And if we look at paragraph 69, prior to starting, Hoodless recalled getting together with the team socially in a pub where they loosely discussed tactics. When asked, he said they did discuss the prospect of encountering high-profile people and believed that to do so would potentially endanger the operation, possibly getting it shut down. They wanted to focus on what he referred to as the street rats, the children victimised in the process by adult suspects. He was asked to clarify his position on the discussion regarding high-profile suspects and what he would have done should one of the team have encountered such a situation. Hoodless said that he would have discussed it with the team and also Colin Reeve, so that a collective decision could be made. He was asked to consider whether their first meeting in the pub, when high-profile suspects were considered, may have unwittingly created a policy decision not to pursue high-profile persons. Hoodless said, and this is quoted,
Yes.
"We agreed we would not go for high-profile people because we were worried that we might have been shut down, as it might not have been in the public interest if we were to come up with politicians' names or people at Buckingham Palace, so we didn't do it. We were aware that we had a number of suspects to target and wanted to focus on what we called the street rats. That said, we never came across any high-profile people during the operation, not one." And the report adds, paragraph 72, his statement makes it clear he had concerns about taking on establishment figures and the potential risks this may have added to the operation. He added that he did not have any direct experience that such encounters would be problematic, but considered the prospect as a common-sense probability. He went on to confirm that no high-profile suspects were ever identified in the operation. Now, is there any possibility it was Inspector Hoodless who gave the briefing that you're talking about?
No, I couldn't say.
Were you one of the officers at the pub?
No, most certainly. I would have been too young in service to be sitting with the old detectives. That would not happen.
Not to have a drink.
No, I'd be making the tea or doing something like that. That would not happen.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, did you note in paragraph 71 where he says, we agreed we wouldn't go for high-profile people because we were worried we might have been shut down as it might not have been in the public interest if we were to come up with politicians' names or people at Buckingham Palace. And do you remember when I asked you earlier, and this appears in one of your statements, that your understanding of prominent people in the briefing you say you attended was just that, MPs and royalty?
Yes.
So do you think there is any possibility that this was a kind of law that was LORE rather than LAW?
Yes.
A culture, perhaps, in these teams at the time?
Yes.
But you're still sure it was a briefing and nothing that you picked up, perhaps, from canteen talk?
My recollection is that we were in a briefing, and that was sort of implied that, you know, it was more a question of, if you find anything, we need to know about it. But that's no different if we came across any other suspect. Yeah. They would need to know about it. And my take from that was, then the next bit was along the lines of, and it may shut down. And I just thought, as I said, it's back in the 80s, but I just thought, hang on a minute. I just thought it was strange for a comment to be made. And it would have been mentioned by myself and other colleagues, and I'm surprised that no one else has actually said yes. But it's there. It was mentioned. No. It may not have been from on high, but it was certainly an inference that was given to staff that this may happen if we come across. I have nothing to suggest that any prominent persons were identified and that it was covered up. I'm not suggesting that in a million years. But it was implied that that was a possibility if we did come across anyone. Now,
Mr. Hoodless and his team were involved in the initial phase of Circus. You weren't. You came in on Circus later than that. Yes.
We came in simply because of the sheer volume of photographs that they had to wade through.
But my question is really about this. If what we just read, yes, John Hoodless had told his team in a social gathering, and the question being asked, do you think you might have just created a sort of policy decision which perhaps filtered outwards? Do you think there's any possibility that when you came in on Circus, after what we have just looked at, that really what was being filtered down to you, whether at a briefing or at in some other environment, was really what John Hoodless had said during that period?
I appreciate where you're coming from, but my recollection, it was the environment that I was in at the time. It was within the setting of a meeting, and that was said. I vividly remember that bit.
Well, when you say meeting, is that different to a briefing, or is it the same sort of thing?
It's the same sort of thing.
And go back, please, to page 13 of the Jordana report, if you would. I just want to ask you about a couple more paragraphs, 59 and 60 on page 13. And this is what the overall man in charge, Michael Colin Reeve, had to tell Jordana. He was specifically asked whether there had been a strategy in place to deal with prominent persons if or when they came to notice. He said there had not been a strategy for this because the operation had been focused on a group of known suspects, kept under surveillance over a period of time. He said the suspects were successfully arrested, charged and put before the courts. Reeve also said if any persons of prominence had come to notice, they would have been dealt with in the same way as any other suspect. And when asked about the briefing described by you, if you look at paragraph 60, he said he didn't give such a briefing and felt it unlikely that anyone else would have done so, given that he, in other words, Colin Reeve, was the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer. He said that he didn't recall an officer by the name of Groves in any event. So any comments about that, Mr. Groves?
No, I think you made a valid point. Briefing, meeting, play on words for a better word. But that comment, or that sort of implied suggestion as to what could happen,
Yeah.
I would not have been present with any of the senior officers or experienced detectives having a drink and having a chat. That's not the way business was done then. And to the best of my recollection, it was in the setting of a meeting stroke briefing when that was implied. Of that I'm positive about.
Well, if you go back to paragraph 13, I think the final paragraph.
Did you say 30?
1-3.
1-3, sorry.
13, page 5. We can actually see what the team was in the initial phase of Operation Circus, because the officer in overall charge, as we saw, was Detective Superintendent Reeve, but under him was a sergeant by the name of Platt. Inspector Hoodless is there, but a number of PCs, including Stephen Kershaw, whose name you recognised,
Yes.
and a DC Vince Payne. So it wasn't senior officers.
No.
This gathering appears potentially to have been the team, which included some PCs. But you say you definitely weren't at that social gathering.
No. Back in the day, it was very much a question of senior officers used to always have their people that they would call upon to be part of the team. And that would have probably been the main protagonists, the ones who would decide what happens next.
Yeah.
And everybody else that followed after that would just be instructed as to what to do next. So I wouldn't have been privy to any of the discussions that they would have had. We would have just been informed what to do from on high, for a better word.
Yeah. Now, I think the final thing, Mr. Groves, final tab 6 in your bundle, we see a news article, which I'm sure you are familiar with, and perhaps we can put it up on screen, INQ 004076. The headline, Scotland Yard detective, I was told to ignore meat rack VIPs during paedophile probe. Former Chief Inspector Howard Groves was told to ignore paedophile VIPs. Inspector investigated West End paedophile ring with alleged links to MPs. Boys supplied to men in Piccadilly Circus in area known as the meat rack, and it's co-authored this article by Martin Beckford and Paul Cahalan for the Mail on Sunday. And if we turn to the second page, we can see at the top the date, the 23rd of January, and it was updated in the early hours of the next day, 2016. How did this article come about, Mr. Groves?
I'm trying to remember. Somebody obviously approached me.
Why do you say obviously?
Because I wouldn't have approached the press. That's most certainly I wouldn't have gone to them.
You mean the Mail?
Sorry?
You mean you wouldn't? When you say I certainly wouldn't.
Oh,
have
the
gone
Mail.
to
No,
yeah.
I did not approach the Mail. My recollection is somebody contacted me. One of the issues for me is it sounds like as if I was told directly. Obviously, I wasn't spoken to. I was spoken to within a group setting. So I'm not particularly impressed with the way in which it has been sort of drafted, but that's sensationalism for you. I appreciate that.
Well, can we just look at very briefly what it actually says, and let's see what you agree with and what you don't. A Scotland Yard detective claims he was told to ignore VIPs during a paedophile probe, now being investigated by the police watchdog. Of course, in 2016, you were no longer a Scotland Yard detective.
That's correct.
And the police watchdog, presumably the IOPC or the IPCC at the time, is that what the reference is?
Yes.
Former Chief Inspector Howard Groves, who served in the murder squad during a distinguished 34-year career, was investigating a West End paedophile ring with alleged links to MPs and TV stars in the 1980s. I expect on no account would you say that you were investigating a VIP or a West End paedophile ring?
No.
Detectives found that boys as young as 14 were being supplied to men in Piccadilly Circus in an area known by the boys as the meat rack. When you were doing the limited work, but important work on these photographs, as your part of Operation Circus. Had you heard the term the meat rack?
To be perfectly honest with you, I've only heard that. I've only noticed that because I didn't see the article when it was done.
Yeah.
That comment or that remark is not one I'd have used. It's not one I've heard of.
No.
Apart from today, it's the first time, to be perfectly honest with you, I've heard that expression being made.
A rather nice photograph of you, Mr. Groves. Was that one you supplied to the Mail, or one was taken by a male photographer?
No, I didn't supply it to them. I think they probably found it on the internet. That looks like one that was done when I was at Hillingdon Borough some years back. I certainly didn't provide them with it. I think you find it on the internet somewhere.
And then on the 4th page of this article, Mr. Groves, now 58, told the Mail on Sunday, and you see quotation marks, "I remember we were called to a meeting and told by a senior officer that if we found any establishment figures involved, the investigation would be stopped." Did you say that to the authors of this article?
We said that we were called to a meeting and told by a senior officer. But it depends if you're talking about I wouldn't have used the word senior officer. I may have said a supervisor or senior officer.
It's in inverted commas.
Yes.
So did you accept you must have said this?
Words to that effect.
Right. Names of MPs, celebrities, and that's why I asked you about celebrities earlier.
No. I don't recall using that word celebrities. I just said persons of note, and MPs most certainly.
Well, it reads, and this is not in quotation marks, but names of MPs, celebrities and businessmen did surface during the inquiry, though Mr. Groves, who retired in 2014, wasn't privy to them, which would be right.
Yeah.
And 25 men were convicted. The operation was led by Met Commander Trevor Lloyd Hughes, who died in 1986 amid claims of soliciting male prostitutes. Now, I'm sure you've read this article before. Was it being suggested by the Mail that it was Trevor Lloyd Hughes, who died in 1986 amid claims of soliciting male prostitutes,
Yes.
that was about him and his private life?
Yes.
Mr. Groves said, again in inverted commas, the command not to investigate establishment figures was relayed by a senior officer and I believe must have come from Trevor Lloyd Hughes. Now, I'd like to ask you about that, please. First of all, do you accept you said that?
No. Would not have said it came from him because to be honest with you, I couldn't recall who was actually in charge of the investigation at that point.
Well, the sentence or the quotation, as it appears to me, can mean one of two things. It either means that Trevor Lloyd Hughes gave the briefing, or perhaps more likely that it was a senior officer who remains unidentified, but the order to give that briefing came from Trevor Lloyd Hughes. I believe must have come from. But you say you're not responsible for having said this to the Mail on Sunday.
I don't recall actually giving his name per se, no.
Is it possible you said this? It's some years ago, but is it possible you said that, Mr. Groves?
Well, if that were the case, it may have been mentioned to me that he was in charge of the investigation, and I may have said, well, if he was in charge, it possibly could have come from him.
Yeah, because of course, certainly in 2015, when you mentioned Trevor Lloyd Hughes, you didn't associate him with that briefing at all, did you?
That's correct. So
in any way,
no,
directly or indirectly?
No, I think my recollection is it may have been brought to my attention that he may have had some involvement, and I would have said, well, if that were the case, then maybe he would have probably been the person who may have done that.
No. And then this, Mr. Groves's claim is one of 31 allegations of Met corruption relating to child sex offences that the Independent Police Complaints Commission, as it was, is investigating. The numbers went up, but that was right, certainly at the time of this article.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Groves. Thank you very much. Chair, do you have any questions or any of the panel members?
Yes, we do. Ms Sharpling first.
Thank you, Mr. Groves. Just a couple of questions, if I may. When you were seconded to what you now know to be Operation Circus, Were you given an indication or any instructions what it was actually all about? What were its terms of reference or objectives?
No, my recollection is I had arrived at the police station, Rochester Row, one morning, and I was told later on, you're now seconded to an inquiry, and I was told where to go, and when I arrived there, we were just given actions and said, this is what you need to do, but nothing as specific as you're asking, no.
Did you understand roughly what it was about?
Yes, I understood that it was an investigation into indecency with boys, and that they were trying to identify some of those victims, as well as the venues where those photographs may have been taken, and that was as much as we were told.
And in your search to identify the victims from the photographs, were you given any instruction as to what you should do should you come across a boy who was in the photograph?
We would write up our actions to that effect, giving information as to how we identify those boys, and we would put it back through the supervisor in charge of what we would in those days call the MIR.
You weren't given any instructions as to what should happen straight away if you were to come across one of those boys?
I can't remember specifically.
I see. Thank you.
Sir Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Mr. Groves. Just for clarification, you said that you originally made your comments following the media broadcasts in 2012. Is
Yes,
that correct?
that's the Dolphin Square. Yes.
Yes, because I just noticed that in the Operation Ossia, it suggests that you made them in 2015. So it was 2012 that you made the original complaint, or you raised the issue?
2015, I'm trying to work out when I retired. I'm not quite sure. My recollection was 2012 that the article or something in the press around Dolphin Square, and then sometime after that I reported it to a senior officer.
Yes. It's just that in paragraph 2 of the Operation Ossia closing report, it mentions that you made contact with the service concerning concerns in March 2015. So I was just wondering.
Right. That may very well be the case, but to be honest with you, I can't remember.
Right,
That.
thank you. Nothing has been said, understandably, about Operation Broadsword, which you originally thought that you were involved, that you were concerned with. Could you just say a little about what Operation Broadsword was actually about?
Operation Broadsword, at the time I was a detective constable in Brent Borough, which covered Wembley, Kilburn, Willesden, northwest London. And we were told by the detective chief inspector at the time, whose name was Roger Gasper, who then, I think he retired at the rank of commander. And they were doing an inquiry into allegations that there were minors, particularly boys, attending a particular address in Kilburn. My understanding is that there was a proactive investigation done where there was surveillance being done on a particular address. And on a Friday evening, we went part, myself and other colleagues went part of it. We were just aware that this was happening. And persons were arrested. We had, I think we probably brought some of the boys that were actually arrested at the venue with a particular individual back to the police station. We were told, thank you very much. You can have your weekend off. That was it. I then got a phone call on the Saturday and was asked to come back in. And I was surprised why they want me to come back in. Yes. And it transpired that one of the victims had actually run out of the police station because he was being spoken to in a less sympathetic manner by certain officers. And myself and another officer were tasked to go and find this individual, bring him back, dust him down, deal with his needs and everything like that, so that the investigation could carry on.
Okay.
So that's why I remember Broadsword, because it was a similar element about indecency with boys. Right. And could I just go back to one question that was asked earlier on? Yes, you were talking about the processes that were supposed to be employed during Operation Circus. Because I was young in service, the officer that was with me, DC Phil Marshall, he had much more experience. So if there was any issues around identifying victims, it would have been more than likely he would be the officer who would have progressed any inquiry at the time. I was junior in service and I would be looking to him for advice as to how we deal with things.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have no further questions.
Well, thank you very much for coming, Mr. Groves. You're free now to go, and Chair, looking at the time, that might be a good time to take our break.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Groves.
Thank you.
We'll return at 11:25. Please sit. It's not.
Chair, the next witness is Andrew Surplice.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and
the
nothing
truth.
but the truth.
Full name, please.
Andrew Surplice.
Now, Mr. Surplice, I'd like to ask you, please, about your career in policing. You have in front of you a file, and perhaps we can follow it and you can refresh your memory from it if you need to do so. Behind tab 1 is a statement which you made in November, or at least signed in November of last year, and paragraph 1, but just take us through that, please, your career.
Well, I joined the police in 1979 as a police constable. I was posted to Acton Police Station.
Can you just turn towards the microphones? Don't look at me. It might be easier. Do you see you've got microphones either side of you? So just amplify your voice because you're dropping your voice.
Sorry, I had a hearing infection last week. So
all right.
I'm
Well,
not
just keep
speaking
your
loudly.
voice loud and clear if you can,
Yeah.
please.
So I joined the police in 1979 as a police constable at Acton Police Station, which was a substation of Ealing. I served my 2-year probationary period there, and then I was posted on to the District Crime Squad, and that later amalgamated with 3 other crime squads as a larger team in West London covering Southall, Uxbridge and Ealing. I was a uniform PC at the time. I then was successfully joined the CID, did my CID course and was posted to Hammersmith in 1985. I was there for a couple of years, took my sergeant's exam and moved to Kennington as a police sergeant. Was there until 1993, and then when I moved to Scotland Yard, where I stayed until 1997 and moved to Heathrow for a year. I passed my inspector's exam and was an inspector at Staines for the next 2 years. Then I did a year at the National Criminal Intelligence Service until 2001. I briefly did a job at Director of Professional Standards, and then I moved as a DI to Scotland Yard in 2002, and then served in the Coroner's Officer Service until my retirement in 2009.
Thank you, Mr. Surplice. Now, I'd like to ask you then about some police operation that you were at least indirectly involved with. Operation Circus, did that mean anything to you?
Well, it did, yes, at the time, because there was lots of talk about it.
And were you directly involved in Circus, or,
No.
or you weren't?
No.
But were you part of a team who found itself at a flat in Ealing where some photographs, indecent photographs of children were found?
Yes, my recollection was that I think it must have been on a Friday. There must have been an arrest of this photographer at an address in Ealing.
Yeah.
A load of photographs, indecent photographs, were discovered, and we had our weekend annual leave cancelled, or weekly leave cancelled, and about 5 or 6 of us were posted there in shifts. So a shift of 5 or 6 people replaced by another shift of 5 or 6 people.
Right.
And our job was to see who turned up, basically.
Right. Can we just rewind a little? Did you understand that the volume of photographs that were recovered from that flat or seized from that flat were, and you give a figure for it in your 2018 statement, 20,000?
That's what stuck in my memory.
Did you yourself see any of the
No.
imagery?
No.
But of course, in those days, and I'm going to ask you when those days were, we're not talking about digital imagery, we're talking about physical photographs.
That's correct, yes.
Can you year date this for us?
Well, we now believe it's 84, 85.
Right. And that's because you've been, what, sitting
Well, it's
here
because
in
I've
the
read the
room?
papers.
And
yeah,
the papers.
I mean, I thought it was in that patch there because I was on 2 different crime squads covering Ealing at the time.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that fits.
Well, you joined the force in 1979. You became, as I understood you, a CI, or at least joined the CID, or
After this, yes.
after this. So what was your rank at the time?
I was a police constable.
Still a police, what,
Yeah.
uniform police constable?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you understand what the general remit of the part of the operation that you were indirectly involved with was?
Well, as I remember it, it was a rush job,
A rush job?
really rush job. So we were called out at the last minute. My understanding was the arrest had taken place, large number of photographs. No one really knew what was going to happen. Are a lot of people going to turn up at the address to participate, to buy victims what? But the fact that it was, as I believe it anyway, was a weekend,
Yeah.
it would have cost them a lot of money because it would have been what we called a less than 8, so we get our rest day back, plus we get time and a half. They've abolished them nowadays.
Yeah.
At a time when overtime was in short supply. That shows the seriousness of it, or the seriousness of it, how it was taken. So that, yeah, it was to play it by, in a sense, to play it by ear. As far as I remember, there was no documented written briefing of this is going to happen, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. What my memory is that we would go there and we'll see what happens, but people were going to get arrested, and we clearly expected quite a lot of people to come.
Let me come back to that. In addition to what you estimated to be 20,000 indecent images recovered.
Well, that was what I was taught. That's what I heard. That's what I remember.
All right. In this flat, did you also understand that seized from the address had been an address book?
Again, that's something I was told.
By?
The detective in charge.
Yeah.
Because the things I remember him saying there was an address book, and it would have been photocopied, and it had names of lots of people in it.
Right. And the DC in charge, when he told you, as I understand your evidence, that there were the names of lots of people in it, what was the nature of the people, or some of the people, whose names, according to him, appeared in this book?
Well, we all, again, this is all sorts of people from all sorts of walks of life.
And what about
I don't know whether he'd actually read it
Yeah.
or not,
Well, let me...
but there was certainly the suggestion that there were powerful people in there.
Yeah. That's what I want to ask you. When you say the suggestion, where did you get that from? So somebody had obviously put in your head, because this isn't the first time you've said it, that powerful people, or the address book contained the names of powerful people. And if let's just look at what I'm looking at, which is your paragraph 4 of your 2018 statement behind tab 1. Do you see paragraph 4? At some stage during the operation, I was told that the photographer had an address book containing details of clients, and I believe the detective constable in charge mentioned that it contained the names of, quote, powerful people, unquote. I don't recall the exact words used, but it brought to my mind people in positions of authority and power. I didn't see the address book, and I wouldn't have expected to, and I was not told any specific names.
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
So, doing your best, you had understood from something you were told by the man in charge all those years ago that the address book contained names of powerful people.
Yeah.
But nothing more was said to you about it?
No.
By anyone?
No.
So you were left to your own imagination?
Well, it was
as to
just the
what
people in
powerful
the
meant?
flat talking, yeah. But
Right.
there was no names speculated on at all.
And as you say, you never saw the address book
No.
and wouldn't have expected in
No.
your position at the time to have
No.
done so. So wherever that address book has gone, you never saw it?
No.
Now, as you said, this was a rush job. You and some other officers were posted at the flat in order to arrest anyone who turned up, and the idea was, if they did, you would take them to the police station and discover their role.
Yes.
And that's what you say in your paragraph 5, I think it is. But no one did.
No.
And you were stationed there. You thought it was a weekend, so what, on a Saturday?
Well, definitely there was Saturday, and when I came back on the Sunday, I think that's when the bloke from the flat above came down.
Yeah. So the only person who did turn up was somebody else who lived in the building,
That's what I was told.
and you understood that he had some connection to a newspaper.
He was well, again, what I was told was he was a deputy editor. He had 2 children
Yeah.
who he allowed to visit the downstairs flat, which, you know, we all thought was very strange,
Yeah.
because certainly I wouldn't have allowed my kids to, knowing that the person downstairs was a paedophile.
Yeah.
And he was the only person, and he was let go.
Right. So putting him to one side because it appears he lived in the building, no one else turned up.
No.
And you say in your paragraph 6 of your 2018 statement that you and the other officers felt that this was unusual because there was a lot of us, we had expected people to attend the flat.
Yes.
Had you been given any briefing about what was anticipated in terms of numbers? I mean, did anybody say we're expecting lots of men to turn up,
No.
or were you told we just don't know, just be
I
there?
can't remember that. I mean, what you can go on is the fact that there were so many of us in such a small place says that we were expecting a lot of people to turn up. I mean, you know, normally you'd have a couple of officers doing a job together, but to have basically 3 teams,
Yeah.
plus another 3 teams coming on later on, is a lot.
No. And it was because of the numbers that you assumed a few people, a few men should be turning up to this flat.
Yes, we definitely had high expectations that there would be lots of work for us.
And any men that would arrive were there, what, to buy photographs, presumably?
Well, we
in those
didn't know
days?
what.
Right. So you were there all of that Saturday, presumably, and how long would the shift have been?
I think it was about 12 hours.
12-hour shift, with the same other, what, 5 or 6 other
Yes.
officers? And if we're right and it was a weekend and the next day was a Sunday,
Yes.
did you return to the flat?
Yes.
And did anybody turn up on that day?
No.
And what happened on that second day?
It got cancelled.
Means,
Abruptly.
Which means what?
Well, we got stopped and sent home.
Right. Had you done a full 12-hour shift,
I don't
or was
think
it
so,
during the
no.
course of the shift?
I think this was during the course of the shift. We were told to go. And I remember we had a discussion about why. And again, the person in charge at the time said something about powerful people. Now, whether that's...
Well, let's have a look at what you said in your paragraph 9 of this statement. I believe that on the second day of the operation it was cancelled suddenly. I can't recall how we were told, but I believe that the second day was cut short. This struck everyone as unusual because, as I mentioned, they had spent a lot of money on the operation, and as far as we were aware, nothing had come of it. at the time, I recall somebody said that someone high up had called off the operation, but I can't recall who said this. And I don't know for definite whether this was the case. The implication or suspicion was that the people who were named in the address book were being protected. Now, first of all, is that your recollection?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
And someone high up had called off the operation. Did that mean high up within the police or beyond the police?
Oh, in the police, I imagine, but I mean, we had a structure, so we had a DC, we had sergeants above us, and we had a detective inspector in charge of the squad.
Yeah.
But obviously, we'd been tasked by Operation Circus to do this particular piece of work. But it could have been anybody in that wider chain of command. I just don't know.
Yeah.
What I can say is I don't ever remember having a debrief afterwards as to why or any reasons or anything.
Was that unusual itself?
I would have thought so, but again, I think, you know, in those days, you just sort of went on to the next job. You were toy soldiers in a sense.
Yeah. In your earlier statement, if we can go to that, please. Which I think we'll find in the second tab. And this is your 2016 statement. Let's look at how you dealt with it there on the final page. My recollection was that our part of the operation was cancelled very quickly. And we were surprised, as I recall, that we expected a lot of work from it. I don't recall how we were told, but I think it was at the end of my second shift at the address. I don't recall how the conversation came about, but I recall that there was some suggestion that it was called off because high-powered people may have been involved. I'm not aware that any other people or property being removed from the property or our operation, probably should be on our operation. I'm not aware of any of the people who were arrested in Operation Circus. I believe that the link to the high-powered people may have come about as their names could have been in the address book that were seized, although I've never seen the address book or any copy of it.
That's correct, yeah.
In my email, I suggested two questions because I think you'd emailed somebody on the IOPC or a Met police officer on professional standards. Somebody by the name of Roberts, perhaps, was it? Don't remember. Why didn't the expected people turn up? Why was our operation stopped? And you say, I think this is a fair question, as throughout my service I've been aware of instances where people may have passed on information that could have compromised an operation. The operation may have been stopped because of the suggestion that high-powered people may have been involved, although I've no direct evidence to support that. I've not been involved in any other aspect of Operation Circus. And then you were asked about how the operation was documented. So in terms of your knowledge of other instances, were you sort of, in 2016, looking back at your experience over all those years? Because what you were implying here is there must have been some form of tip-off.
It certainly felt like it at the time, because we were all geared up to a lot of work, and all of a sudden and a lot of expense went into it, which is unusual. And I think it's, you know, thinking back on the time, there was stricter controls on overtime.
Yeah.
So budgets were tighter. So for somebody to put the operation together, for that expense at that time, on the most expensive time of the week, it was important. And you wouldn't have done it unless you were going to expect a result out of it. Yeah. And for that result not to occur, and it just to be curtailed, felt strange, felt wrong, this left questions hanging there.
And all these years afterwards, by 2016, you're making a statement and you say that you are really aware, effectively through your service, of instances where people may have passed on information. So were you looking back?
Looking back, yes. And even at that time on that particular crime squad, you know, you go things, pub raids where there's nobody in the pub. Somebody's clearly made a phone call.
Yeah. So what I want to be clear about is when you came to the view that there must have been a tip-off, was this in 2016 looking back, or at the time when, as it were, you were with your brother officers outside this flat and the whole thing was called off, nobody having turned up. Did you...
I think that's probably later, because I think at the time the feeling was strongly that somebody senior had, for whatever reason, just said stop. And that didn't feel right. That left, yeah, it didn't feel right.
I mean, there's a possibility that the whole operation was called off because nobody turned up, and it was
Could have
purely
been,
innocent.
yeah. I mean, there's
Yeah.
loads of reasons, isn't there?
Yeah.
But that includes also other things.
Such as?
Well, that somebody in a position of power and authority has decided this is getting too close to the truth and we don't want to go through it.
Yeah.
I think particularly as we'd been told there was an address book with people's names in it, and we thought, and this suggestion that there was powerful people in there, you were expecting some result of that. You were expecting some flack from it, some interest, some, you know, it to lead on to other things. And when it didn't happen, that seemed very strange.
Well, when did this concern of yours first really come to mind? Was it...
Well, when we got cancelled, because we discussed it there.
Yeah. And when was the first time you reported it?
Well, when I saw it on the BBC, that this inquiry was going ahead,
Right.
and I thought maybe this is going to corroborate somebody else, be some relevance to it.
You accept, I'm sure, Mr. Surplice, that in the intervening period, if you had wanted to, you could have reported it to the Police Complaints Board, the Police Complaints Authority, the IPCC as it was.
And do you seriously think they'd have taken anything from that?
Well, that's not for me to answer, but it is something that you could have done.
I
don't you,
could
sir?
have done, yeah,
Yeah.
but nothing would have happened.
Especially after your
There's no
retirement.
evidence, it's only opinion, isn't
No,
it?
I know, but, well, there is evidence because we're listening to it now. But you retired in 2009, and therefore you didn't have any particular direct loyalty to the Metropolitan Police. Don't you think you might have reported concerns then?
No, I think at the time you were doing, you know, you're a young officer in a structured, organised, disciplined service. You're told that job's finished and you move on to the next thing. I had no evidence of corruption. I had a feeling that something wasn't right, and that was it.
Can I ask you this then, moving away from that, and some questions that we've been asked to ask you by others. Looking back and based on your years of experience, thinking about the address book for the moment, what do you say from your experience should have happened to the address book seized from the flat, where thousands of indecent images had been recovered?
It would have been photocopied, page by page.
Even in those days?
Yes, as a working copy. Then the book itself would have been sealed and locked away securely in the property store.
But somebody would have presumably gone through it.
Well, they've gone through the copy.
And to look at the names.
Yes.
And who would have conducted that operation or that investigation at that time?
The arresting officers.
Let's say there were the names of high-powered people in that address book. How would that, or should that, do you think, have been investigated?
Well, that would have been... I mean, my understanding is that if it was a proper investigation, investigation team set up, then somebody would have been appointed to go through the book and assign leads to other people. So, as you've already heard, there's people will be given actions to follow up various different bits and pieces.
Yeah. Well, let's say that one of the high-powered names in that address book, or several, were MPs and peers associated with Westminster. How should that have been handled, do you think?
Well, on the squads that I was on at the time, the person who would be the office manager would be doing assigning the actions in conjunction with the senior investigation officer, and that would be, so you have a detective sergeant normally doing the actions, and him and the senior investigation officer, they would make a decision on what would happen.
Right. Would you have expected if in that address book there appeared the name or names of such prominent people, do you think they would have been spoken to?
Yeah, there should have been. I mean, the whole thing's without fear or favour, isn't it?
And might that have led to arrests of those people if there was sufficient evidence to
Absolutely,
support
yes,
it?
yes.
would there have been an intelligence side to this? Would there have been an intelligence operation before any such arrests were made, or do you think it would have been handled on a purely evidential basis?
You go on the evidence you had.
And from your experience, and if you can't tell us, please say that it's not within your experience to do so, but would any other agencies have been involved with this if a person of public prominence had appeared in that address book? Would the police have liaised with other agencies, other partner agencies?
I've no idea. I mean, I've never arrested
No.
anybody who's prominent.
But I take it from your evidence, because you didn't see the address book, and although it appeared as if the name of powerful people might have appeared in this book, if they did, you never heard of any of the names?
No. But it would be inappropriate for people to band them about, wouldn't it?
It might be, it might not be. It depends on what goes on in an organisation like the Met at that time and whether people are talking to each other.
Well, the people would talk. If it's something that needs to be kept confidential, then you wouldn't. Then it should be kept within the people who need to know.
Right. But as far as you're concerned, if there was such an address book, whatever became of it, we don't know.
No idea. I mean, I certainly believe it existed because we were told it existed, and there's no reason to be told that otherwise.
Final thing, please, Mr. Surplice, from me. In the final tab of your bundle, you'll see something I've already referred to with the officer who came before you, Mr. Groves. And we can see as part of Operation Jordana, if you go to, and let's put it up on the screen, if we go to page 3 of IPC 000842, and under your name, do you see those 2 bullet points?
Yep.
You're one of 4 officers mentioned within paragraph 4 as being one of the 4 sources for the impetus underlying Operation Jordana. Surplice recalled he was based on a crime squad at Ealing when he was tasked, along with other officers, to police an address in the Ealing area. He remembered it was the home of a photographer arrested in Operation Circus, where a large quantity of photographs and other correspondence had been seized earlier. He understood his role was to deal appropriately with whomever turned up at the address, either customers for photographs or boys to be photographed. So it wasn't just customers. Looking at that, it could also have been victims themselves.
Yes.
And pausing there, can I ask you this? If any victims had turned up, what were you to do with them? Say a 14-year-old boy turned up by himself, expecting to be photographed indecently by the photographer, whether for money or otherwise. What instructions did you and the team have about what you were to do with them?
I don't remember the instructions, but what would have happened, they'd be taken to a place of safety, i.e. the police station, and they'd be treated as a victim, and we'd find out from them what's going on. It was an investigation.
And would they be passed on to other social services?
Well, if they'd been sent to the
agencies?
police station, the social services would have been contacted and stuff like that, yes.
All right. But none did.
None did.
And then the second bullet point, you expressed concern that nobody attended the address as expected, implying that they may have been tipped off about the police operation. He was also concerned and surprised that his part of the operation was stopped quite quickly, and he suspected that this may have been because prominent people could have been involved. And really that's based on
That's based
the
on what was
account
told when it was cancelled.
and the
yes.
account that you've already given
Yes.
us. If we go towards the back of this report, please, to page 30. We don't have to read it, but you can see this is where the report, from paragraph 159 onwards, sets out, in effect, the account that you have already given us, concluding at paragraph 166. I'm not going to go through it. And then page 39, please, where we see what the conclusion of Operation Jordana is as far as you're concerned at paragraph 213. the concerns raised by Surplice that punters may have been tipped off about the police raid at the photographer Dean's address have only been raised by him. No evidence has been uncovered that provides any insight into the expected amount of traffic at the photographer's address. No details exist of operational briefings given to the officers policing the address, and an aspect of that you've just told us. This aspect is therefore difficult to assess. The lack of punters could have any number of explanations. Surplice's suspicion that his part of the operation may have ended because of the possible link to high-profile persons discovered in documents seized is personal to him. No evidence has been uncovered that supports his suspicions. He also admits he had no evidence himself. With the lack of available information to properly assess this aspect, it lies beyond further proportionate investigation. So as far as Jordana is concerned, that's an end of the road, as it were, to what you have to say. But having looked at everything and you've seen this closing report, Mr. Surplice, do you change your mind? Do you allow for the possibility that perfectly legitimate explanations could exist for why the operation was cancelled, or do you still have that nagging suspicion that there could have been a tip-off to explain the absence of any visitors to the flat?
The feeling at the time was something, it was unusual and it was untoward and it left a bad taste.
Yeah,
so therefore something, it wasn't a normal cancellation.
And is that bad taste still there?
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Surplice. I'll see if the chair and panel have any questions.
We have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Surplice.
Mr. Surplice, thank you very much for coming. Chair, the next witness will be Robert Glenn.
Yes, yeah.
Just repeat the words after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Glenn, give us your full name, please, first of
My
all.
full name is Robert Ian Clive Glenn. I'm a retired Superintendent, Metropolitan Police.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. You've made a couple of statements, and you have a file in front of you. You may not need it, but if you go to the first tab, you'll see there is a statement that you made to this inquiry in January of this year, and there must be about 20 lines of history of your career,
That's
Mr.
right.
Glenn.
That's correct.
But just give us a potted outline, if you wouldn't mind.
Without wishing to bore the inquiry too much, I joined the Metropolitan Police in March 1963. Served some time in South London before moving on to Scotland Yard, where as a sergeant I was undertaking operational research in a branch called A21. From there I took promotion and became an inspector, and transferred from Scotland Yard to Bow Street Police Station. In August of 1977, I transferred from Bow Street to Clubs Office at West End Central, and remained for some 9 months to a year, undertaking a variety of duties involving obscene publications and vice. And from then I moved on back to Vine Street, then back to Scotland Yard, where again I was undertaking operational research. Then I eventually went to Marylebone as an inspector, promoted to chief inspector, and served at Clapham. I then served at Brixton as the operational, as the complaints chief inspector. Then moved on from there back to Scotland Yard, where I was discipline chief inspector in a branch called CIB3.
Yeah. Complaints investigation.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
I was I did complaints. I was the complaints chief inspector at Brixton,
Yeah.
and then moved on from there to Scotland Yard, doing purely disciplining police officers.
Just for a moment, CIB3 in particular, what was its remit?
Its remit really was we received all the bundles and all the files from investigations into police officers, where it was believed that there was either criminal action was required, or in fact discipline action was required. And we had two chief inspectors. I was one of the chief inspectors undertaking basically prosecutions against police officers.
Yeah. And was it limited to corruption or misconduct in public office, that kind of?
It was a wide range of things. It's certainly sometimes corruption, a whole range of things.
And so you retired as a superintendent?
I retired as superintendent.
In 1994?
In 1994, that's correct.
Now, I'd like your help, please, with the club's office. You've already mentioned it, but I'd like to understand something about how it's operated. And the reference I'm really looking at is in your inquiry statement of paragraph 5. I'd like to know, please, first of all, what the club's office dealt with and where it was located.
Well, club's office was a specialised office set up at West End Central, dealing with a whole range of aspects that basically uniform officers didn't deal with. Now, the officers in clubs were uniform officers operating in plain clothes. And you principally had two sections. One was dealing with obscene publications.
Can I just ask you, Mr. Glenn, to just slow down a smidge?
Sorry?
Because I'm detecting you're going a bit quick.
Sorry.
And if
I do beg your pardon.
all right, because these poor ladies have to type everything that's being said. All right.
Yeah, the club's office was divided into two halves. One section was dealing with obscene publications within the West End, with bookshops, cinemas, and a whole range of different other aspects. And the other half was dealing with vice. Now, vice was viewed as living on moral earnings, prostitution, gaming, overseeing supervision of clubs, and a lot of other aspects that basically uniform officers didn't deal with. We dealt with in clubs office. Right. But that's principally the main aim of clubs. But it was uniform officers operating in plain clothes.
Yeah. And I'm again still looking at your paragraph 5 of your inquiry statement. So the statement you made earlier this year. Who was it first of all headed by in terms of rank?
I think it would be safe to say it was unique, because you had a chief superintendent in charge, but the next rank down were inspectors.
Yeah.
There was no superintendent. There was no chief inspector.
So headed by a chief superintendent, and so the next rank down was an inspector.
Inspector.
Was there any particular reason for that? Its uniqueness?
Not that I know of, no.
Did it have any logical explanation that you can think about?
No.
No. But it was unusual.
It was unusual. It was unique, because I'd never come across a setup like that before.
And how many? So there was what? The one chief superintendent.
You had one chief superintendent. We had two inspectors.
Two inspectors.
And then you had possibly 5 or 6 sergeants operating within the two halves. And then where there were constables, PCs operating.
When you say the two halves, what? Obscene
Obscene
publications and
publications
vice.
and vice. Yes, that's correct.
And presumably a number of PCs.
Yes.
And where did it operate out of, the club's office?
Out of
West End
West End Central.
Which was where?
At Savile Row.
Now, during your time, and again I'm looking at your paragraph 5, who was the chief superintendent?
The original chief superintendent, when I first joined clubs, was we had a new guy arrive called Tom Parry,
Yeah.
and I think he'd come from Liverpool.
Yeah.
And he was running both. You're obviously, as the chief superintendent, you're in charge of both
Yeah.
both halves of the office.
So he was in charge. He was the overall command.
Yeah, he was the overall command. Yeah, that's correct.
And you remembered that there was a time, and we have to remember that you were within the office. You told us from, what was it, August 77?
Yeah, that's
for
right.
about 9 to 12 months.
That's right.
So sometime during that period, August 1977, when you were there for 9 to 12 months, Tom Parry disappeared off to Hong Kong
Yes,
for a
he
few
did.
weeks.
That's correct.
Was that a posting, or?
I don't know, but he went. Whether it was a holiday or not, I don't know. But I distinctly remember him going to Hong
Yeah.
Kong.
And while he was away, did a temporary chief superintendent come in, and you'll remember his name.
That's correct. Neil Diver.
Neil Diver. And he'd come in from Vine Street.
He'd come in from Vine Street. He had previously, prior to my time, been chief superintendent clubs, and he had left. Obviously, Mr. Parry had come in to take up the post, and as it was in those days, you went back to your original posting, and he went back to as chief superintendent of Vine Street. But what happened was the fact that when Mr. Parry was away, Neil Diver was asked basically to keep a watching brief and supervise.
I see. And so, thinking back now, what's your impression of how long Neil Diver was around? I'll come back to when he left and why he left, but in your mind's eye, how long was he around?
Are we talking about clubs office or West
While
End?
you were working in the club's office,
Yeah.
as the incoming chief
Yeah.
superintendent taking over from Tom Parry.
He was, I'd say about 3 weeks, maybe 3 to 4 weeks, no more.
So a fairly short period
Yeah,
of time.
it was. But of course, he also, if I could add to that,
Yeah.
he was also a divisional chief superintendent running Vine Street. So he was merely ad hoc coming in from time to time, just supervising.
So does that mean he was still running operations at Vine Street?
Yes, that's correct.
So he had a dual role?
Yes, he did.
Right. Now, did you, before I come on, but I just want to ask a general question about the kind of work that you might have been involved with or knew about when you were in the club's office. Were you aware of Piccadilly Circus and the meat rack, as it was called?
Yes.
And was the meat rack, was that a term, or the chicken rack, a term that you had heard at the time?
Yes, I knew about it. It's, terminology is a bit off, but I'm afraid, yeah, it's where rent boys,
Yeah.
as we knew it, gathered.
And in general terms, I'm not going to ask you about this specifically, perhaps apart from one further question, or two. But what was the sort of age of the boys who would prostitute themselves in the Piccadilly Circus area be?
I think a lot of people think that the meat rack, as it was referred to, is a kind of Dickensian type of place where young lads ran around. It wasn't like that at all, actually. The majority of the boys that I knew about were either mid-teens to late teens. And I would add that I was a duty officer at Vine Street prior to going to club's office. And I had what we call a relief, which is a shift of about 18 to 20 officers. And one of the beats we had was round by Piccadilly Circus.
You were a uniform PC?
As a uniform inspector,
Inspector.
I was a duty officer
Yeah.
at Vine Street, and that was just round the corner. It's
Yeah.
a little road off Swallow Street, possibly doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And we would regularly have officers bring in young boys they have found possibly to run away from home in the area of Piccadilly Circus, and we brought into Vine Street. It was quite common.
What was the youngest that you remember?
I don't know. I can't. They certainly weren't tremendously young,
No.
but I suppose you were talking about 13, 14-year-olds and things like this who possibly run away from home.
And do you remember, it's a question that I've asked other former officers, but do you remember when boys of mid-teens, even to late teens, were brought in having been perhaps plucked from that area in Piccadilly Circus? Were social services engaged?
Occasionally, yes. Yes.
And occasionally because?
Because these children are in need of care.
What circumstances would there be when there was no need for social services to be involved?
Where there's straightforward, where they'd run away from home, for example,
And
where
was
we
there-
have other, it could be another police service involved,
Yeah.
where, you know, we check and find that the child or young person is wanted, and we would contact other police services or contact parents and they'd come and collect them.
But they wouldn't be allowed back onto the street.
No, because you had to provide a safe place, safe environment, really.
Now, remind us, if you would, so that I'm clear and everybody else is. What was your rank in August 1977 when you joined the club's office?
Inspector.
You were an inspector?
Yeah.
All right. Now, Cyril Smith, you obviously know about him. And I want to ask you this, please. When you were on the club's office, did he come within your area of operations?
Yes, as far as the vice unit was concerned.
Right. Can we try and date this? Is this within that window of 9 to 12 months?
Yeah, well, I joined in August of '77, so I suppose we're looking at, I did 4 or 5 months that I've seen publications, and then I transferred. It was basically the inspectors would just go back to their stations. So I took up the place of one of the other inspectors who'd gone back to ordinary duty.
Yeah.
So I would imagine it must have been maybe January, February time of '78.
At which time Cyril Smith was an MP in Parliament?
Yes, that's correct.
And what was the nature of the operation into him?
We were certainly one of my teams conducting very much covert observations on Cyril Smith, and I think there's certainly other people who were involved, as far as their involvement with small boys.
Now, you said one of your teams. Were you ever involved in any of the observations?
If there was a problem, I'd go out, but invariably no, because I was there to supervise all the teams. But if there was difficulty or there was something that I needed to see, then I would go out.
And what was the nature of the covert inquiry? Was it observations?
Yes, observations follows and evidence gathering, basically.
Right. And whereabouts were these surveillance operations? Where in London?
I was aware of the observations certainly in and around the West End, and I seem to recall, and I obviously I'm now aware, I seem to recall it was somewhere in North London they were particularly interested in, premises in North London. Right. But I couldn't exactly recall where. Right. But having read other statements, I'm now aware it was Kilburn.
Well, what you're referring to, I suspect, and I want you to be careful about this so that, as it were, you've perhaps not taken something from what someone else has said, and as it were, substituted your own memory for it, or had it substitute your own memory for it. You're referring to statements that you've been permitted to read of Paul Holmes and Malcolm Sinclair.
Yeah.
Put those to one side for the moment, though, because we'll be hearing from them tomorrow. But the operations, the covert operations, you said they involved what presumably static surveillance and mobile surveillance.
Yes.
So static, you've got officers, to use the parlance, plotted up on a location and observing what's going on, and a follow is if the subject, the target moves, you move with it.
That's correct.
As you recall it now, how many of your officers did you have involved in individual observations of that nature? Was it be a team of 2 or several teams, or what?
It would be a team of, as far as I can recall, 1 sergeant and 2 PCs. Oh. It might have been at times just 1 piece, depending obviously the size and nature of the operation.
And observing on foot or from cars, or a bit of both, or what?
Both.
Right. At the same time?
Yes.
Now, can we forget about North London for the moment, because we'll hear about that tomorrow. I want your memory, to the best of your ability. What do you remember when you were the inspector and you were in charge of the surveillance teams? What was Cyril Smith observed to be doing?
If I could just add to that, it was the policy of the inspector in charge of the teams to obviously meet up with the teams at regular intervals to see what work they were doing, what evidence they'd gathered. And I met up with the team who was undertaking the observations as far as Cyril Smith was concerned. I particularly remember meeting up with them and looking at the evidence they had. And it was quite clear there was good evidence to suggest that Cyril Smith was involved in some form of obscenities with young boys.
And what does that mean?
In other words, he was seen going into he was seen in the company of young boys, seen entering property, and I mustn't mention what other people have got in their statements, but this is the evidence that was relayed to me.
Well, can we be clear? Did you yourself ever see Cyril Smith on any observation?
No.
So we're reliant, of course, on what other officers told you that they had
That's
seen
correct.
when you debriefed them.
That's correct.
Right. And as you mentioned it in passing, Paul Holmes and Malcolm Sinclair, before you read the statements, had you ever actually known them?
Yes.
So, were they on your team?
Yes.
Right. And so there is that link, at least,
Yes.
that if they were on your team, that what they will tell us yesterday could be related to what you're telling us now,
If they remember me, yes.
if they remember you, but you remember them.
I remember them, yes.
All right. Now, Malcolm Sinclair was a sergeant.
Yes, he was.
Paul Holmes was an experienced vice PC.
Very experienced.
And Sergeant Sinclair, as he was, came on the team, and I think he says, and you will have read this, that he found Paul Holmes's experience invaluable,
Yeah, that's correct.
and that Paul Holmes was someone with a photographic memory.
That's correct.
And we'll probably hear that from them tomorrow. But your takeout from what your team was telling you, and this includes, do we understand, Holmes and Sinclair?
Yes.
They were on the team, they were the observation team, that they had seen Cyril Smith engaged, I think you said, in obscenities with, did you say young boys or small boys?
Certainly, you know, some 40 years ago.
Of course.
Very difficult. Certainly, as far as I can recall, it was young boys. How young, I don't know. I can't comment any further on that.
Can you tell us any more about the nature of the evidence that was presented to you? Was it, for example, Cyril Smith picking up boys in cars, or was it anything more direct than that, or what?
I can't honestly say. It may well have been. I don't know.
But there came a point where you felt that the team's observations were sufficient to justify the application for an arrest warrant.
Yeah, there was evidence there, clearly, I gained from the team, that there was evidence there that would justify the arrest of Cyril Smith.
And in order to make that application, was it something you as an inspector could do by running off to Bow Street yourself, or did you have to get authorisation?
I would need, bearing in mind the sensitive nature of this particular arrest, then I certainly would have consulted the Chief Superintendent beforehand.
And who was the Chief Superintendent at that point?
It was Neil Diver.
And so because of what you understood to be the evidence against Cyril Smith, did you go and see Neil Diver?
Yeah, just to enlighten you on this, every Monday morning, both myself as the Vice Inspector and the Obscene Publications Inspector would meet with the Chief Superintendent, and we would discuss the various operations we had running, how advanced they were, whether there was any other work we were going to take on. And it was a general kind of management meeting, really, with two inspectors and the chief superintendent.
Yeah. And so did you take that opportunity, or the opportunity of seeing him after a briefing?
I did. And I asked to see him alone.
And what did you say to him?
Well, I told him that we had, bearing in mind that he was there on a temporary basis, we had this operation running. It must have been running quite a few weeks. And as far as I was concerned, as the Vice Inspector, there was sufficient evidence there for me or one of the team to go and lay information before the Chief Magistrate at Bow Street to obtain a warrant for the arrest of Cyril Smith.
Now, and what was his reaction to that?
Incredibly annoyed.
And how did he show his annoyance?
Really, he was angry, really, because he turned around and said to me that we should never got involved in it, and it was far too political nature. It would cause political upheaval if we went ahead with the arrest of Cyril Smith, and we were told to stop.
So he was, as you put it in your paragraph 6 of your inquiry statement, bitterly opposed.
Yes, he was, certainly.
And what was your reaction to his reaction?
Very, very annoyed.
Because?
A tremendous amount of police time had gone into this. There was good evidence here. If it was anybody else, we would have gone out and obtained a warrant. But because he's an MP, there seemed to be this great reluctance to go any further. And I was very, very annoyed. And not only I was annoyed, because I went back and briefed the team. They were equally annoyed.
And the team included Holmes and Sinclair?
Yes.
Any other names you remember?
Now I know, yes. Yeah. I couldn't remember who they were,
no.
But it was Holmes and Sinclair.
Right. But they were, Sinclair was a sergeant?
Yes.
Holmes, as I've said already, was a constable?
Yes, that's right.
What other sergeants do you remember by way of names?
There was Peter Lamb,
yeah.
Dick Griffin.
Yeah. Well, we'll come across some names
Shepherd,
later.
yeah.
Checkley, perhaps, or something like
that? Dave Checkley was an inspector.
He was an inspector.
Yeah.
Now, you've seen Neil Diver. He has shown his annoyance and opposition to the operation continuing, and you come away with the message that's the end of it.
Yes.
What do you do? Who do you go to?
Due to the hierarchical structure of clubs office, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Because I would normally...
I'm just going to stop you, because there is a name of an individual that I'm not going to ask you, the commander, I'm not going to ask you to name him.
I would just say...
But before you do, did you go and speak to Dick Griffin? If you look at your paragraph 7 of your inquiry statement on page... I'm afraid it's not paginated in my copy, but it's page 3.
You see, I thought... I've got it. Dick Griffin, I thought Richard was in charge of that team. I couldn't remember who was in charge of the team, but it wasn't. It was obviously Malcolm Sinclair.
So what you said in your inquiry statement was, having been instructed by Mr. Diver to shut the operation down, I contacted the sergeant responsible, who I think was Richard Griffin.
Yeah, it wasn't. That should read Malcolm Sinclair.
And on the basis that it was Malcolm Sinclair rather than Richard Griffin, what was the point in seeing him?
Well, because I think as his supervisor, he had to be told that the operation had to be shut down.
Right. And what was his reaction to you telling him that?
Equally annoyed as I was.
And I think then you went to, effectively, over Neil Diver's head.
I had to.
And you spoke to a commander, who I'm not going to ask you to name.
Bearing in mind, say, that the structure of the office was such that I had nobody else I could turn to apart from a commander.
Right. And so we understand it, that a commander, what rank is a commander, or was that commander?
Well, as far as county force is concerned, assistant chief constable.
Right. And the commander, who shall remain nameless, that you saw, he wasn't a clubs office
No.
officer. Where was he? In
He was,
Scotland Yard?
each division had a commander in charge,
Yeah.
and this particular individual was in charge of C division.
Well, and presumably you didn't get to see him on the same day as Neil Diver's decision.
No,
Did you have to make an appointment?
I think I spoke to his clerk.
Yeah. And when you saw the commander, and did you tell him what had transpired?
Yes.
And what was his reaction to that?
His reaction, as far as I can recall, was that this is something that I needed to sort out with Mr. Diver.
Did he decline to get involved?
Yes.
Was your impression that he didn't want to get involved?
Yes.
And because Neil Diver had made his decision and the commander wasn't going to intercede, was that the end of the line for the investigation?
Basically, yes, it was. The investigation finished. Having said that, of course, we retained all the notes
Yeah.
and all the evidence.
And what became of that?
Filed. It will be filed
And filed where?
within the club's office.
Did the club's office continue, or did it ever shut down?
Club's office continued, I think, for some
Yeah.
years. How long for, I don't know.
But the record should, if they exist, should have been somewhere within the Met's
Yeah,
archives.
records in those days were kept for 5 to 6 years, same with pocketbooks. And then and if there was no specific reason for retaining them,
Yeah.
they'd be destroyed.
And so on the assumption that the operation had been shut down, certainly as far as Cyril Smith is concerned, and presumably nothing else had happened for 5 or 6 years, they would have been destroyed.
That's correct.
Yeah. No, but it's in the statement. Chair, I've been asked to pause the live feed for a moment. It's not your fault, Mr. Glenn, and we'll ask you to make a restriction order over the past few minutes, and the usual process will apply. So I'll just wait till
I
I'm
will
told
do
we
that,
can
Mr. Altman.
resume. Thank you. Now, all of this then happened during that short period when Neil Diver was the chief superintendent, also in charge of the club's office.
That's right, that's correct.
Did Mr. Parry return to his post after his few weeks in Hong Kong?
I think he eventually did, yes.
Did you ever tell him what had happened?
Which I can't recall.
Is it something you're likely to have done?
I might have done, yeah. Yes.
But you have no
Well,
recollection of it today?
I can't recall.
And you say his name was Tom Parry,
Tom Parry, yeah. He had transferred from Liverpool.
you said. If the operation hadn't been shut down, and had it gone in the way that you would have wanted, you would have applied for a warrant for the arrest of Cyril Smith.
Yeah, it was my intention to go and get a warrant that week, to go to Bow Street, lay information before the Chief Magistrate and obtain a warrant.
And what would the nature of the charge have been, and what would the nature of the information that you'd have laid been?
Certainly the warrant was based on indecency with children.
Right. But as general as that, or more specific?
I think it's going to be, I don't know. I think it may well have been more specific,
Yeah.
but I can't recall how specific.
And had you successfully arrested him, would you have interviewed him under caution?
Certainly, yes, he would have been interviewed under caution.
And decisions would have been made based on that.
Yes.
And I think you've made clear, Mr. Glenn, your position is he deserves no special treatment.
Yeah, exactly. He was a member of the public like everybody else.
Now, you've mentioned Cyril Smith. Are there any other names of individuals who cropped up in that investigation?
Certainly, there's names I read within the statements,
I don't
but
want you
not,
to-
but not that I was aware of at the time.
No. That's why I'm asking you the question.
Not
Given-
that I was aware of at that specific time.
So at the time that you were the inspector on the club's office, the other names, and we'll come to these tomorrow, but the other names apart from Cyril Smith's,
Were unknown to me.
unknown to you?
Yeah.
All right. Now, I'm on paragraph 9 of your inquiry statement, just to
Yes.
get your eye in, as it were, Mr. Glenn. I want to ask you, please, about another investigation, this time at the Hilton Hotel in Park Lane.
That's correct.
Forgive me. Did you have an operation running which involved observations at the rooftop bar at the hotel,
That's correct.
and the prime focus of interest being the manager,
Yes.
observing him because you received information that he would provide high-class escorts or prostitutes for clients and guests of the hotel?
That's correct.
And had the team become aware that rooms were being kept vacant on the floor immediately below the bar in order to make them available for escorts and their clients?
That's correct.
And the information was the manager was clearly involved,
Yes.
if not running the show, presumably.
That's correct.
And was this series of observations being conducted during Mr. Diver's tenure as temporary chief superintendent of the club's office while you were there?
Yes, it was.
And so, as you say in the last line of paragraph 9, both incidents, the Cyril Smith incident and this incident, were in that tiny window.
That's correct.
And what you say is, in your paragraph 10, again, either that week or the week after the Cyril Smith investigation had been shut down in the Monday briefing, Mr. Diver told the team that you had to close the Hilton Hotel
Yes.
investigation down
Yes.
immediately, and you thought in this instance the sergeant on that case was Peter Lamb.
Yeah. I may well have got the name of the sergeant wrong.
Yeah. And he was annoyed, whoever the sergeant was, because time and effort has been spent on that investigation.
Yeah, what we used to do, as far as observations are concerned, if we had information come in or a complaint, then we'd go and do what's called a provisional observation. And it might be based over 2 or 3 days, it might be based over a longer period, depending on what we're dealing with. And you looked at it from a provisional point of view. Once you thought, yes, there's a job here, then you actually went in and did the specific job, and you were there for possibly a week or 2 weeks making your notes and putting everything together. So you had sufficient evidence to support a case.
And in the case of the Hilton, that 2 or 3 days was what, a provisional observation?
Yeah, I think it was a provisional. Yeah.
Well, while I've got it in mind, in the Cyril Smith case, have you any sense now of how long the observations had taken in that investigation?
I don't know. I've got a funny feeling it was over quite a long period. It wasn't just a provisional, it was the actual observation itself. They'd gone past the provisional stage.
Right.
Whereas at the Hilton, as far as I can recall, it was still provisional.
Now, Did Mr. Diver give you any reason why he was shutting down the Hilton Hotel operation?
Not a reason that would satisfy me, no. Basically, I think we were told that there was far more important work to get on with, whatever, something like that. It was basically an excuse, and we should leave the work and leave that particular job and go out and get some other assignment. It's something like that. It was a very wishy-washy reason for closing it down.
In relation to Cyril Smith, you told us he was angry.
Yeah.
And bitterly opposed.
Yes.
Was his reaction similar or not in relation
Not
to
quite
the
as
shutting
bad,
down?
no, but
Not
clearly it was very pointed
Yeah.
to the fact that we had to stop the observation.
Did you discover something from the sergeant, whether it was Peter Lamb or another sergeant, about a relationship Mr. Diver may have had with the Hilton Hotel?
What I did, I'd add to that and say that having told the sergeant that the observation was to be closed down, he asked if, and it must have been provisional, if he could continue and finish the provisional observation, so at least we would have evidence to put away that we could come back to at a later date.
Right.
And I went basically against what I was told, and I told him, yeah, it's going to last, I think it was another 2 or 3 days, finish it, put it away, leave it. And that's the instructions I gave.
Right. And so Mr. Lamb and/or officers under his command continued a few more days'
Yeah.
observations, going behind
Without the knowledge of the chief
going
superintendent.
behind Diver's
Yeah.
back.
Yes.
And as a result of that, did Mr. Lamb or whoever the sergeant was tell you something pretty irregular that they'd seen?
Yeah, I was in the charge room at Westminster Central in the early hours of the morning. I think I'd arrested a man for living on a moral earnings. And I was confronted in the charge room by the sergeant who said he needed to speak to me urgently. I remember getting somebody to look after the prisoner and going outside, and I was told that they had continued the observation in the rooftop, in the roof bar at the Hilton. And while they'd been sitting there at the back, Chief Superintendent Diver had come in and was in conversation, quite a lengthy conversation, with the with the bar manager, who was our prime suspect.
Which, of course, would lead to certain suspicions.
Yes.
Now, do you know what time of day that observation was?
Early hours of the morning. It must have been, could have been between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning.
Of course.
And the majority of our work in club's office
Of course.
operated around late at night and the early hours of the morning.
And of course, Mr. Diver would have thought that the observations had finished,
Yes,
because that's what he ordered you to do.
precisely.
From your experience of Mr. Diver, did he have a nocturnal existence outside the police station?
Yes.
And without perhaps being too unkind, what did that involve?
I think it'd be safe to say he's very alcohol dependent.
And did he disappear from the police station in the evenings, from your experience, and turn up in the early hours?
One of the things as a superintendent or chief superintendent in the majority of divisions, and whether it goes on now, I don't know, in the Metropolitan Police, is that every night we had a late senior duty officer. And it could be a superintendent, it could be a chief superintendent. And you worked between the hours of 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. and you were there to deal with major incidents or any problems that occurred in your division. You were purely there as a consultant, basically, that they could come to you and ask advice. And it was the kind of routine for Mr. Diver to leave the station, possibly about 7 o'clock in the evening, as when he was late senior, not in uniform but in plain clothes, and would disappear.
Right. I mean, you say in your statement, paragraph 14, it's a great shame, as I believe Chief Superintendent Diver, when sober, was a very competent officer.
I'd worked with him in the past.
And you'd worked in the past. But at this point in time, when he shut down the Cyril Smith operation, how was your relationship at that point?
Pretty poor.
Up to that point, how was it? In other words, was it the Cyril Smith thing that made the relationship poor, or had it already become poor?
I think I think it would be reasonable to say we had quite a good working relationship from an inspector come chief superintendent point of view.
But are you saying it was the Cyril Smith event which changed the nature of that relationship? Yes. Had you been friends, or was it just a professional relationship?
No, professional relationship.
Now, in paragraph 13, you actually date when you left the club's office as being the
23rd
of February,
yeah.
78.
That's right.
So that accounts for the August 1977,
Yep.
February 1978. So that's our window for
Yep.
when you were there. And you returned to Vine Street as a uniformed inspector.
That's correct.
And of course, Mr. Diver, because he had this dual role, he was still the chief superintendent there, or not?
I don't think he had a dual role then, because another chief superintendent
Parry
would have taken over. Whether George Parry was still there or not, I don't know.
You called him George.
Well, it was George. I'm certainly sorry, Tom Parry.
Well, you say it's interesting you say that, because there is a George Parry.
Sorry, Tom Parry, not George Parry.
Did he have a middle name?
No, I don't know.
All
I
right.
knew it was Tom Parry.
I was just wondering if, because I've seen reference to a George Parry, are they one and the same person?
I don't think so. I'm convinced his name was Tom Parry.
All right. But, so, he had left the club's office by February 1978. He was back at Vine Street doing his full-time...
Chief Superintendent Diver was then Chief Superintendent of Vine Street, and his role, his participation in club's office was finished.
Right. But was he still behaving in the way that you described a little earlier?
I think it'd be safe to say him and I didn't get on.
Yeah. What about in terms of his nocturnal disappearances in plain clothes?
Well, that went on that used to go on quite regularly.
Right.
You know, it was to the point of embarrassment.
Embarrassment to whom?
Embarrassment to myself, certainly the staff in the police station, because he regularly used to come back drunk.
Now, paragraph 15 of your inquiry statement, please. You then deal with events in July 1979. You say you transferred from Vine Street back to A21.
A21, yeah, field office.
And remind us, what was A21?
Well, it was we used to do, it was operational research, looking at new methods of policing, new equipment, police radios, for example, new types of cars, new methods of policing, which possibly may be experimental, and that's what we used to operate.
And you say there it was within a matter of weeks that you received a call from the inspector of Vine Street, whose surname was Jones.
I think it was Jones.
And you believed his first name to be Les?
I don't know. I thought his name might be Les, but I know he was quite in service, quite a senior inspector.
Yeah. Well, there's another Jones whose name I've seen in Eddie Jones. I suspect it's not him.
No,
but
superintendent.
yeah. So Les Jones is what you have in your mind.
I seem to think it was a fellow called Les Jones, but bearing in mind again, 40 odd years ago, it's quite difficult to remember quite who it was.
No, we understand. But let's not worry so much about his name or first name. What was it he told you?
Basically, he told me that Mr. Diver, when he'd been late senior, in other words, late senior duty officer, in fact, the inspector had received a call while he was duty officer to the Regent Palace Hotel.
Now, pause there. The Regent Palace Hotel at the time, that was right on top of Piccadilly Circus,
Yes,
where the meat broke.
Yes, very close.
Yeah. And what did he tell you?
He told me that in the early hours of the morning he'd received a call, a radio call, basically saying that there was a man detained in the Regent Palace Hotel, and it was either for theft, believed to be theft of a cheque, or trying to pass a forged cheque. He attended, together, I think, with the section sergeant. They may well have gone with the section sergeant. He went there. He saw the receptionist at the Regent Palace Hotel, and the receptionist related the story of how this individual had come into the Regent Palace Hotel, tried to book a double room in, I don't know, I've got the name was, but certainly it wasn't the name of Diver, it was something else. He agreed, and places like the Regent Palace Hotel, you had to pay up front, because there had so many people running off without paying, so you had to pay for the room before you actually got it. He wrote, or attempted to write a cheque out, giving a false name, totally forgetting, of course, his name is printed on the chequebook. And the receptionist, or the reception staff, called the security, and this individual was detained and held in the Regent Palace.
And who was the individual?
Neil Diver.
And was he in the company of anyone?
According to the information I had, yes. He'd entered the reception area with a boy they thought had come from the inverted commas meat rack.
Now, you played no part in any of that
No part
incident.
whatsoever.
So this was all information you
It's all
received from
pure hearsay.
Mr. Jones?
Yeah.
And when he told you it, was it face-to-face or on the phone?
On the phone. I was in the field office at the yard.
Yeah.
That's when I remember receiving the phone call.
So in a sense, it had nothing to do with your present
No, nothing
environment
whatsoever.
at work, but it was perhaps interesting information for you.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Did you hear what became of Mr. Diver?
Mr. Diver was, so I understand, transferred literally overnight to Battersea.
If the facts as told to you by, let's assume it was Les Jones, were accurate, and Mr. Diver had been caught in such compromising circumstances, what ought to have happened to him?
Well,
Not least because although you had, you certainly have had experience of CIB.
yeah.
What ought
I mean,
to have happened?
his conduct within the Force Discipline Code was conduct likely to have been discredited upon the force. And basically, he should have been suspended and the investigating officer appointed.
Yeah. And should have taken its course.
Yeah.
Certainly on a disciplinary level.
Yes.
And on the on the face of what you were told by Mr. Jones, there was potentially a criminal offence, or at least one.
Potential, yes.
For using a forged
Yeah,
cheque or
yeah.
forging a cheque, and whatever other offence might have dropped out of the circumstances in which he was trying to
That's correct.
book the room at the hotel. Now, in your paragraph 16, Mr. Glenn, you know that other officers haven't corroborated the allegations that you've made.
That's right.
And you say, I don't know why that would be, but you say the chain of events stick vividly in my mind, given how angry he was and how upset. So you're talking about the
Yeah.
Cyril Smith incident. And if others can't remember, that's their position, but at the time we worked in a culture where we did as we were told, and you were not encouraged to question operational decisions made by senior officers.
No, I mean, I was an inspector, he was chief superintendent.
Yeah.
And if one rocked the boat too much, you would be very much viewed. It would be very much viewed upon that you were there to cause trouble.
Yeah.
But what I would add to that is that I said here that people don't recall. Problem was I couldn't recall Malcolm Sinclair and Paul Holmes. if I had remembered those, they may well have remembered me.
Yes. Can I ask you to look at a document which I think is in your file behind tab 3, and I'll ask for it to go up on screen, OHY 005078.
Yeah.
And this is the note of a meeting that you had, it looks like, with Operation U-Tree. Does that make sense to you in 2012?
Yes, it does. Yeah, yeah.
So this is 2012. And if we can just expand the middle section, beginning approximately April, May. If you have a look on screen, it may be easier,
Yeah.
Mr. Graham.
Yes.
Approximately April, May 1978, Inspector Glenn authorised surveillance on Cyril Smith, member of the Liberal Party. Now, can that date be right in light of the fact that you left the club's office on the 23rd of February?
No, I think the date is wrong. It was, if I've got to say, I can't remember vividly kind of authorising this. I know the operation was running.
Mm.
Whether I authorised it or not, I don't know, but certainly the date would have been wrong.
It can't be April, May 1977 either, can it? Because you didn't start at the club's
No,
office.
it didn't start until August.
And beneath that, it reads, Mr. Glenn can't recall the provenance of the original intelligence, but states that after a couple of weeks of preliminary observations on more than one address, and a further 2 weeks of more concentrated observations. So pausing there, that answers the question about how long this operation
Yes, it
was.
does. Yeah, I know it ran for some time. It wasn't just one of these things where we did about a 10-day observation on it.
And as a result of having seen the surveillance logs and photographs, he was content that there was sufficient evidence that Smith was involved with underage boys, aged around 13 or 14, to apply for a warrant.
That was the case. Yeah.
So it wasn't just observation logs, but there were also photos.
I seem to recall there were photos. Yes.
Now, you remember I asked you whether you had seen Cyril Smith yourself, and I'm not criticising you, but do you remember now whether there were photographs that you have seen of him, as it were, in flagrante delicto?
Certainly there were photographs from the observations. Exactly what they amounted to, I can't remember. But all the photographs did, really, was reinforce the evidence.
Yeah.
And that's why I felt there was sufficient evidence there to justify applying for a warrant.
Yeah. How did it come about, this interview with Operation U-Tree in 2012?
I saw something in the press that an investigation, I think, was being contemplated. And I phoned, I've forgotten who I phoned now. I phoned somebody involved in the setting up the investigation and said if I can give any assistance because I've got some evidence that might be useful.
Right. What was it you saw in the press?
Oh, it was just I don't know, there was, what drew my attention to it was a photograph of Cyril Smith.
Was the...
A photograph of Cyril Smith, and there was basically various allegations being made, and the fact that there was, it's very difficult, I can't recall exactly what it said, but I had a funny feeling there was something about possibility of setting up some form of inquiry or investigation.
Can I ask you this question, which I'm sure you'll feel is a fairly obvious one, but between, let's say, 1978, when the Cyril Smith operation was shut down,
Yeah.
the Hilton Hotel incident occurred under the supervision, let's say, of Neil Diver, and all of these years passed until 2012, when potentially you saw an image of Cyril Smith and Operation U-Tree speak to you. Why didn't you report these clear concerns you had about the shutting down of two operations, one in relation to a person of public prominence, in the intervening years to any of the independent bodies as they, as it were, they evolved into the IOPC over all those years?
I think you're quite right. Hindsight is a marvellous thing. Yeah, looking at it now, I should have done. But I just felt that people weren't interested.
I mean, for example, you retired in 1994, so
Yeah.
you had nothing to lose.
No, that's right. You're
After
perfectly correct.
retirement.
Yeah, I could have done.
Yeah.
But I felt it was water under the bridge. It was such a long while ago that nobody interested.
Yeah. So, with that by way of background and coming then to 2012 and your approach to Operation U-Tree, what had changed?
What had changed was it was being brought to the public attention. And prior to that, even you know, colleagues didn't really want to know.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Glenn. It's 1 o'clock. I'm not finished with you quite yet.
Okay.
Hopefully not too much to go, but with the Chair's permission, we'll rise now for lunch and probably return at 2 o'clock.